start recording. And are we recording? I think we are recording. Right, so hello everyone. Welcome to RSP podcast with me, Rajjan Parmar. I'm here with Antonio, am I right saying this right? Nicaso?
Correct, yes, Raj.
How are you? Thank you for coming on. So you are an expert on the mafia, I believe, and international and organized crime.
Yes, I teach courses on the history of organized crime and mafia culture in American and Canadian university.
Yes, so I was actually given your details by an old student of yours, Anna Frankel, who recommended that you were the man to talk to about this. So, well, can you just give us your background, where you come from, and how you got on studying it?
Yes, I originally from Italy. I published 36 books about this topic. My area of expertise is the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, one of the world's most powerful, least known criminal organization. For decades, the Ndrangheta was invisible like the dark side of the moon. The attention was only focused on the Sicilian mafia. But I believe the success of this organization lies in how it fuses the business skills of a multinational corporate finance with a stubborn grip on archaic rural traditions. If I have to compare the Ndrangheta with the Sicilian mafia, it's easily clear the distinction. Like other mafia group, the Ndrangheta is held together almost entirely by actual blood relationships.
So it's very interesting. So where are they based out of? Because like you say, it's like sort of the dark side of the moon. It was something that I'd never really heard of, and something I've only started recently researching.
Yeah, just to give you some information about the Ndrangheta. This organization annually makes more money than Deutsche Bank and McDonald's put together, with a turnover of 55 billion euros. And the main source of income is international drug trafficking, specifically cocaine. And the Ndrangheta is one of the few organized crime groups truly globalized. And so I spend almost my entire life studying and learning about this specific criminal organization, but of course many others, such as the Yakuza, the Triads, the Vorivizzaconia, drug cartels, and so on.
It's very that's so interesting. So how did you begin studying it? What drew you to it?
How did I discover this topic? It wasn't by choice. When I was 6.5, a schoolmate father was killed by the Calabrian mafia because he refused to purchase construction material from the boss who controlled the area. Believe it or not, we had to choose between the indifference of many and the knowledge of few. I choose knowledge. It was in the spring 1971. I started to ask questions about that specific murder and many other aspects of the violence in my hometown, a small village in Calabria in southern Italy. I remember spending days in collecting news clips about the Calabrian mafia and other mafia like criminal organization. I was very young, but my dream was to write about the mafia, to document its history, its international reach. What I learned over the years is that, contrary to popular belief, the mafia ultimate goal is not money, like many people could assume, but it's power. Money, it's simply a tried and true way of helping attain the power and the influence that makes a crime family respected. That's why when I try to explain what the mafia is all about to my students, I make a clear reference to an organization which is similar to a power system based on collusions and connection. And its violence is linked to political and economical interest. It's impossible to understand the complexity of the mafia if you just focus on the violence. It's important to focus on the ability of those criminals to connect the underworld to the upper world. That's what the mafia is all about. If they need to invest money, if they need to launder money, they cannot rely on their own skills and resources. They need to reach out to identify people outside the organization, people capable to help them in some specific but important tasks of the criminal organization.
Fascinating. That's so fascinating and interesting. So, I mean, I guess the best way to start is that how, I mean, I've looked into it. Would you say it's structured like your stereotypical, say, like the Sinaloa cartel, where there's various federations, or how would you say the structure of the mafia goes?
But it's a little bit different compared to the Sinaloa cartels. Drug cartels originally have focused only on drug trafficking. And in that way, they were very different to a mafia or mafia-like criminal organization. The mafia and mafia-like criminal organization, it's an organization that focus on the control of a territory, and they run a variety of criminal activity, from extortion to loan sharking, from drug trafficking to gambling and so on. Of course, Sinaloa cartels and other cartels in Mexico are moving towards that direction. We heard news about traditional cartels able to include in their core business extortion and many other criminal activities. The structure is a little bit different in the sense that it's not about one man with many associates, like in the Mexican or Colombian cartels. Imagine Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, and so on, people with a strong charisma. In terms of structure, I think the mafia and it's more democratic in the process to elect its own executives, its own managers. But of course, it's a structure with a boss, with an underboss, with an advisor, with people in charge of several crews. They called those people capo decina. And then each decina, each crew has at least 10 or more soldiers, people that carry all menial works, foot soldiers, and of course, associates, many people outside the organization that help the organization to achieve its goals.
Very interesting. So, I mean, I mean, can we start to sort of like, I guess, can you give us the origins of them in sort of well, I guess how they started and got their powers in Italy and came over to North America? I believe so. I'm looking into did my research, is that it started with, what's his name now? Is Salvatore Maranzano? Is that right?
Yeah, they actually a little bit earlier than that, but many people believe that organized crime is a descendant of the Sicilian mafia. It evolved in a linear fashion, beginning with the mafia in Sicily, emerging in the form of a black hand in North America's immigrant colonies, and culminating in the development of La Cosa Nostra in North Americans urban centers. In reality, organized crime is not related to the emergence of the Sicilian mafia, but it was rooted in the social structure of Canadian and American society. Vice syndicates could not have existed without the official blessing of those controlled municipal, county, state, provincial governments. Organized crime was not imported from Sicily, but was entrenched, bred in the socially disorganized slums of many Canadians and American cities, where elected officials routinely franchised vice and crime in exchange for money and votes. They called machine politics, political machines. And that's what we should looking at when we need to understand the origin of organized crime. In Sicily, many people believe that the mafia at one point, once upon a time, was on the side of the poor against the rich. A kind of organization that protect the poor, the low income people of the society against the abuses of the mainstream, the ruling classes. In the reality, the mafia was a product of the ruling classes of the city. Imagine vigilantes, imagine landowners who land huge piece of land, and they have to protect those land against the possible rebellions of the farmers. And so they hire those vigilantes that eventually became mobsters, acquiring a kind of independence. So imagine vigilantes working for landowners to control any possible rebellion of farmers that have been exploited for centuries, farmers forced to work in a very difficult condition, making a very poor wages. That's what the mafia was at the origin. Then they were able to get together and to create their independent organization, but always connected to people in power, never against the people in power, always connected to power. That's what the mafia is all about.
Wow, wow, that's so interesting. So they start as vigilantes and they move into like, I guess, because from what I've heard, I guess, like, I know a few people from Sicily and stuff, is that is still relevant now. Do you say that they're still very much the power in Sicily now?
Yeah, exactly. When you're thinking about organized crime, Imagine the chemical formula for water. The two atoms of hydrogens represent the violence, but what makes the difference is the atom of oxygen, which is the relation to power, the relation to the upper world. I earlier make a reference to professionals who help mobster to launder money, and that is the criteria. The criteria is that you can live at the margin of the society. You have to enter into the mainstream. You need to connect your main resource, which is the violence, to political, to economic interest. That's what the mafia is all about. It's not just about violence. Violence is important. It's a great resource, but you need to build connection to people outside the organization. You need to infiltrate politicians. You need to infiltrate law enforcement agency. Corruption is the best weapon available to criminals at this point, and that's why the concept of a mafia is still relevant today, because they are they continue to connect themselves to people in power. That's what the mafia is all about. Not only, of course, in Italy, but in many other countries, because if you compare the mafia to the Yakuza, to the triads, to the Vori in Russia, you see that they all have this connection to people in power.
So I guess it's sort of like, I mean, the best way to describe it is that sort of you can, that sort of just the silent reassurance that violence is on offer if you don't cooperate.
Of course,
wow.
It's a great resource, but to use that resource, you need to be connected.
So what sort of things do they look at getting into? Because I know that, like, for example, you worked on the Netflix series Bad Blood, correct, as well? You were consulted on that, and that's about the Canadian mafia and Vito, Rizzuto, like, sort of, how is it they describe that they sort of they make sure that their contracts get to make the buildings. Is that correct?
Yeah, but the Netflix series is based on a book that I published a few years ago, Business or Blood or Bad Blood. And it's a book that I wrote on the life and death of Vito Rizzuto. As you mentioned, he was the most powerful and notorious Canadian mobster. Few days ago, I was interviewed by National Geographic. They are doing a television series about drugs, and so they asked me a question about Vito Rizzuto. So I describe him as a blend of business and blood, a master diplomat and a vengeful strategist. I'll explain why I called him a master diplomat. But first, it's better to understand that he came from a long line of mobsters. His father-in-law was the boss of the mafia in a small village in Sicily. His father was a boss. He became a boss. He becomes a boss. So his story is a story of a man who ran a crime group that grew from a small operation in rural Sicily to a mammoth North America based crime operation with grasping hands reaching Europe and South America. So why I called him a master diplomat? Because one of his major criminal accomplishments was to create a consortium, a strategic alliance between the mafia, the Hells Angels, street gangs, Colombian cartels, Irish mobsters. The idea was to make everyone happy, create an organization capable to combine experience and expertise from many perspectives. The mafia had contact with Colombian, Venezuelan drug traffickers, and they were able to import a huge quantity of narcotics. The Irish mob had control of the docks of Montreal, so they were able to make a container to disappear as soon as he arrived in the port of Montreal. The Hells Angels, they have a network with many chapters around the world, and so they are great in terms of distribution. And he relied on street gangs because they control turfs and they are great in selling narcotics on the street. So, but in addition to that, at the peaks of his criminal career, he managed to connect the underworld to the upper world, as I explained to you before when I was talking in general about the mafia. He understood that corruption is the backbone of the mafia, no? And his scope went far beyond Montreal. He spoke 4 languages and conducted the crime business in all of them. So in an era of globalization, Vito Rizzuto carried North America organized crime into the 21st century. So that's what I learned studying this character for almost 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I've done my research into him as well. And so from what I understand as well is that when he was put into prison, he was in the middle of a turf war. Is that correct as well? And then since then it started sort of falling apart. And then with his death now apparently is that you know, it's a bit more in disarray. Can you sort of explain what happened? And is there also rumors, am I right in thinking that he may have been poisoned?
Yeah, that's debatable. It's just a rumor. But what we know, he was in power until he was extradited to the United States to face charges for his involvement in the 1981 murder of 3 renegade captains of the Bonanno family. There was a power struggle within the Bonanno family, and Vito Rizzuto was asked by Joseph Massino, at that time the underboss of the Bonanno, to kill these 3 captains who were tried to took over from Phil Rastelli, who was the boss of Bonanno. So this man avoided any kind of investigation. At one point they called him the Teflon Don, the Canadian Teflon Don, because he was able to avoid any charges, any police investigation. But when he was extradited and eventually convicted for conspiracy to commit murder, when he was in prison in Colorado, he was desperate to fight back, but he can wait for his release. And when he was in prison, a group of people within his organization started to challenge his power, and they eliminated, he killed his son, his brother-in-law, his father. So imagine this powerful man who used to be a control freak. He could wait for his release, and when he finally walks free, an epic Shakespearean revenge plays out with devastating consequences for everyone who was involved for everyone who challenge his power. So I thought of how the Italian great author Dante Alighieri said at one point, he said that the hottest places in hell are for neutral in times of moral conflict. So Vito acted the same way. He had people dead for sitting on the fence, incapable to make a decision, to choose one side instead of the other. And he was clearly determined that there was no middle ground. So I remember a case in Sicily where one of his associates, one of his closest associates was killed because he wasn't able to choose between Vito and Vito, former right-hand man, the person who challenged the power of Vito Rizzuto. And because this guy, he said, I can't choose between Vito and between Renaud Desjardins. Renaud Desjardins was challenge the power of Rizzuto. And for that, the fact that this former associate of Rizzuto was unable to make a clear decision and remain sitting on the fence, he was killed. So it was a story in some way that was not only about violence, but also about power, about relation to powers, because in the middle of the story there was a committee of inquiry that identified the involvement of the mafia in the process, the government process to select some companies and assign them some important public works. What the commission learned was that the mafia led by Vito Rizzuto took, I believe, 2.5% on any public works in Montreal. So that's the idea of mafia that I'm trying to share with you, and it's the type of mafia that I like to describe in my books, because it's not only about violence, but it's about power.
They literally, I mean, by the sounds of it, they literally build themselves into the city with the concrete, right? Like they build themselves in. They take a part of everything. You say so 2.5% of public works.
Exactly. Actually, the politician took 3% of on any public works. The mafia 2.5%, and then other percentage, smaller percentage, went to bureaucrats and to leader of union organizations. So there was a kind of cartel that control all the public works and share some of the money, use some of the money to bribe the mafia, the politician, bureaucrat, engineers, and union leaders.
Wow, and I guess how would they like approach and you know, how would they approach, and like what sort of suggestions of violence would they put in to make sure that they could get into these positions?
Sometimes when you are well established, you don't need to intimidate it, because your name is the best way to strategize your power. Now, the idea of a Rizzuto crime family, well connected, very powerful, stronger, was just a way to convince people that they should sit down with Vito Rizzuto and discuss to any possible deals. And it was the reputation. In some way, the mobster in the era of new technology, believe it or not, are assisted by search engines such as Google. They don't have to kill someone. They don't have to send a message. You can just Google the names and understand the reputation, the past, the history of some criminal organization. Some people are discouraged to resist their request because they build their power on a reputation of a people capable, willing to use violence, but also a reputation of a people well connected to the political and economic spheres of society.
Interesting, I guess. And so, well, what would happen if you resisted? Like, I mean, what if you said no? Would they kill you straight away? Or I guess it also kind of leads into one, you know, in like, or are we talking like, you know, a Godfather situation where you know they cut off the horse's head and leave it in the bed? Like, you know, what would they go straight for murder, or would they use intimidation tactics?
I think they in the past they use intimidating tactics. They try to immediately kill the person who resists protection money. But sometimes restaurant owners, businessmen understand the idea of including the cost of protection in their way of doing business. So at the end, they have to raise the cost of their product in order to cover the protection. Some people said, oh, it's similar to have an insurance, to have a security alarm system. And so they don't understand that accepting that kind of protection put them in contact with people and make them very vulnerable. It's not like buying an insurance, but it's the mentality of many people. So I don't want to have a problem. I don't want to have trouble with them. So I pay them and I will build the cost of the protection money into the price of my product. So if they own a restaurant, they will just rise the cost of some dishes, products, and so on. So that is the kind of attitude. But in the past, the mafia, especially in Sicily, kill the people who resist the request of protection money, because that was a way to punish one and to send a message for what going to happen to you if you resist protection money. And so those kind of murder was done just to send a message to other people in case they decide to resist a request from the mafia.
Right. So yeah, that's interesting. Almost like a sort of a war tax, extortion sort of thing. But do they get? I mean, in these communities, is it common for them to be welcomed in? Like, I mean, is it just kind of tradition, or like, you know, are a lot of people do it just simply out of fear?
No, I don't think it's something that has to do with tradition. It's something that has to do with the ability of a criminal organization to create an international network. The mafia and the mafia-like criminal organization are now all over the place in several continents, and they use the same techniques. In Sicily, for example, in the last 20 years, many people decide to create organization to resist the mafia. So there is something that you can see, that this strain of Sicilian to fight the mafia, because we have to be fair and say that the mafia was born in Sicily, but also the Manti Mafia was born in Sicily. So But I don't see the same attitude in many other countries. I see, for example, that many countries accept the idea of using drug monies. For example, money laundering in the last 30 years became the oxygen of the legal economy, and we don't do enough to address this issue worldwide. Only 1% of the proceeds of crime has been recovered so far every year. So that means that it's very easy to launder money, to invest the money, and that's what they need in order to survive. They can live stuck on a huge volume of cash. They need to invest the money, and there are people, professionals of any kind, willing to help them. And there are countries that really do not care about where the money comes from. They care only about violence. And this is what the mobsters learned. So they try to avoid violence, and they try to keep a low profile, because if you don't see violence, if you don't see blood on the street, you don't perceive the existence, the presence of a criminal organization. Normal people associate an organized crime group with violence. If they won't use violence, if they use corruption, if they use a kind of strategic violence, not the one that you practice, but the one that you make people to perceive. I'm able to use violence, so don't force me to do so. And so they understood that if they keep a low profile, they will be able to avoid police and media attention. And that's what they are doing in many countries around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so, because I guess, like, for example, like that, you know, they don't use violence. I mean, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing they don't use violence, sort of like we mentioned earlier, like the cartels do, where they leave bodies in the street and things like that. It seems like the mafia always have this reputation of doing things under the covers, like, you know, they do them out of the public eye.
Yeah, there was a moment in which the mafia used the same strategy of cartels to kill and eliminate the magistrate, the politicians, even innocent bystanders. But that was a moment in the history of the Sicilian mafia. The government, the state, was able to react and to practically exterminate the so-called Corleone clan, the Corleonesi, led by Toto Riina, a very violent and powerful mobsters. So, but that was probably one of the few moments in the history of organized crime when the mafia decide to challenge the states. In the rest of the long mafia history, the mafia always tried to find a compromise, to avoid violence, to sit down and make a deal. That's a tradition, the strategy of the mafia, and the strategy of many other mafia-like criminal organizations.
Interesting, sort of these gangster politicians, right? So I guess, well, I know you're very busy, so we'll start getting towards to a close. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is your book. It just sounded really interesting to me. That one that I'm actually definitely going to read is Made Men: Mafia Culture and the Power of Symbols and Rituals. Is that so? That looks to sort of like debunk the myth of like, you know, of how we see them in the movie, you know, like as I mentioned to you earlier, you know, the film The Godfather, that's the one that everyone goes to think of. You see them, of these men of honor who, you know, they don't attack children, they don't attack women, and that your book is to sort of debunk that myth. So can you explain it to us?
When with Marcel Danesi, a brilliant semiotician, we decided to write Mad Men, our goal was to, as you mentioned, the banking, deconstruct the mystique of the mafia, the image of a mobster as a little but nonetheless principled gangster who live by a code of honor like common street criminals. So we are convinced that we believe that the best weapon against the mafia, or at least against the lure that the mafia holds for young people, is to expose its code of honor as something that is mostly, I can say, fictitious and self-serving. And as you said, the goal of this book was also to debunking the myth that the mafia never killed women or children, and that the mafia once upon a time was on the side of the poor and the weak. So that was the goal, and I think the idea to combine a book with hundreds and hundreds of students, I have 700 students every year, and so share those important information with them. To me, it's more than be an instructor, a professor. It's sharing something very important to raise concern of organized crime, to make people to understand that the mafia is totally different than the one portrayed on Hollywood, and that's what I'm trying, that I'm teaching at Queen's University, at St. Jerome University, and at the Middlebury College in the United States. It's a kind of a mission, and I like when students understand my feedback from people that say,
Hello.
yes,
I just disconnected
I was able to do.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I just disconnected sort of there. Can we just backtrack a little bit and re-say that?
Yes, I say that my best reward is when I receive a feedback from students many years later, and they inform about the decision to study law, to be a crown prosecutors, and to continue this idea of fighting the mafia-like criminal organization, and uncover their links to the so-called upper crust, the link to the upper world.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's a really fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So I'll just leave you with sort of one or two more questions. Is what I mean, first of all, is that what would you say is, is the future of the mafia? How do you see them continuing as they mean to go on, and what can be done to sort of combat them?
We are seeing that the mafia is very an organization capable to adapt to any situation. During the COVID-19, the first wave, they were able to continue doing business in a different way. They had to change just a little bit, but traditionally, the mafia was always able to convert the crisis into opportunity. So the future, it's a more an organization more involved with the computer, with cyber crimes, with the dark web. So an organization able to use and benefit from new technology, globalization. What we should do, I was mentioned earlier that Ndrangheta is a truly globalized mafia. I wish that the law enforcement will be able to join force and cooperate across the world, because it's not a problem that you can solve by fighting criminals in one country. And also I wish that the people get the right idea of the mafia and understand that you cannot fight criminals only with law enforcement and courts. You need to fight them also from a cultural perspective, because it's a cultural problem. And I think we do have a resource. What we need, it's a political will. The idea that politicians get together and pass legislation, help police to seize confiscated proceeds of crime. That 1% of proceeds of crime that they are able to confiscate from mobsters, it's really a shame. And I think we need to do more and better to fight criminals.
Wow, thank you. Wow, that's really, really interesting, and I'm sure we can go for much more. But I know you were saying that you're a busy man, so I will leave you there. But thank you very, very much for coming on. I found it really interesting and really insightful on a topic and a group that I actually didn't know too much about, and I'm sure the listeners will feel the same. But I mean, like I said, I'd love to get you on again sometime if you have some free time to talk about the other gangs that you investigate, such as the Russian Mafia, etc. If you have the time, I'm sure we'd love to get it on. But where can we find your books and your work?
Yeah, my books and my work, you can find the information about them on internet, on Amazon, everywhere. So I published 36 books. I think I cover a variety of issues, and as you said, in some of the books, I focus on other criminal organizations. So it will be a pleasure in the future to discuss other topics, to talk about other criminal organizations with you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. I hope all my listeners did too. So thank you. You take care out there, and keep up the good work.
You too. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.